Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Wakefield. I'm the program coordinator for the National Council for History Education, and we're very pleased to bring this important conversation to you today. The National Council for History Education provides professional and intellectual leadership to foster an engaged community committed to the teaching, learning, and appreciation of diverse histories. We have a variety of professional activities for anyone interested in history and how we teach it, including webinars, colloquia, professional development, online trainings, and conversations like we're having today with noted historians and history educators. You can find out more at www.nche.net or follow us on social media. There are some guidelines for today's conversation. If you have questions as Candacy Taylor is speaking, please put those into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Following her presentation, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Please keep comments in the chat box germane to our conversation today and family friendly. We hope you will write in the chat your comments as we go along, and I will share those with her. So we are delighted to have Candacy Taylor with us today for a critical conversation entitled Overground Railroad, the Green Book, and the Roots of Black Travel in America. Candacy Taylor is an award-winning author, photographer, and cultural documentarian working on a transdisciplinary project based on the Green Book. Taylor is the author of the best-selling book, Overground Railroad, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America, published by Abrams Books. She's also the curator and content specialist for an exhibition that will be toured by the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service, starting in September 2020. The exhibition will travel throughout the United States for 3 years. Taylor was a fellow at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University under the direction of Henry Louis Gates Jr., and her projects have been funded by numerous organizations, including the Library of Congress, National Geographic, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Park Service, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the National Trust. Taylor's work has been featured in over 60 media outlets, including The Atlantic, CBS Sunday Morning, The Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Newsweek, PBS NewsHour, and the Wall Street Journal. Candacy Taylor lives in Harlem, New York. So all that being said, join me in welcoming her today.
Well, thank you so much for the lovely introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this. It's an honor to be here, and I'm glad that we get to at least do this through Zoom in the middle of a pandemic, so we're still powering through. I'm just going to start out by, saying over the last 20 years, I've traveled, almost about 500,000 miles throughout America, documenting different subcultures, everything from female bullfighters to aging diner waitresses to hairstylists that serve over 10 different ethnicities, whether it's Pakistani, Jamaican, Orthodox Jewish communities. And I stumbled onto the Green Book by accident, actually. In 2013, I was commissioned to write a travel guide on Route 66. And while I was doing research on this guide, I was struck that over 95% of the books on the subject had been written by white males. And practically everything I read celebrated this, the white suburban families jumping into their Airstream trailers and, getting their kicks on Route 66. And there's just an enormous amount of nostalgia connected to this fabled highway. And being a Black female ethnographer, I just wondered where were the Black people? And that's how I learned about the Green Book. I was at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. I was living in LA at the time. And when I saw my first copy, they had one tucked under glass in a corner. And I never knew such a thing had existed. It was about 2013 when I saw this. And so I ran outside and I called my parents. My mother had never heard of it. She was from Ohio, but my stepfather, Ron, pictured here, he grew up in the Jim Crow South, and he remembered. He grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. And he told me a story about growing up in Tennessee. His father had a good job with the railroad, and they had this nice new 1953 Chevy sedan, had all the modern features, and he was going on vacation with his parents. they were pulled over by a sheriff right outside of town. And as the sheriff was walking to the car, Ron's father turned to him, looked at him, he was sitting in the back seat, and he said, don't say a word. And Ron remembers he had never heard his father talk to him in that tone before. It was so serious. And so when the sheriff gets to the door, to the window, he says, where'd you get this vehicle? What are you doing here? And who are these people with you? And Ron's father answered, well, it's my employer's car. He pointed to his wife, and who was sitting in the passenger seat. He pretended not to know her. And he said, she's the maid, and her son is in the back, and I'm taking them home. And the sheriff said, well, where's your hat? Because he said, he had this employer's car, and his father said, it's hanging right up in the back seat, officer. And the sheriff waved and said, all right, move on. And that black chauffeur's hat, Ron said, had been hanging in the back seat for as long as he could remember. And he never knew what it was or why, because nobody ever used it, and it was just always there. But he said everybody had one, and he always kept it in the car. And he saw it in other black men's cars from that day forward, and he understood what that was. My stepdad, Ron, he died the week I started writing this book. And it was heartbreaking to lose him at such a pivotal point in the project but when people die, it really calls us to look back on their lives. And it wasn't until he died that I realized how much of his experiences and the stories that he was sharing with me during the time I was doing the research for this book, that I realized they touched nearly every chapter of this book. Because we talked more the year before he died than we had in any other time in our lives. He was so proud of the work I was doing, and he told me this book had to be the most important thing in my life. And he said, you don't have to be out there gallivanting, and don't let anything distract you. And he said, just sit still and write this book. And that's what I did. I was in Bisbee, Arizona when I started writing the book. I was doing research on green book sites in the Southwest, and I would sit here pretty much and recount all my stories about Ron and cry because I was still grieving. But his stories became a touchstone for every chapter of the book, and he kind of went from being my guardian to being my guardian angel. Another man I was focused on a lot during this process was Victor Green. He was the man who created the Green Book. He was from Harlem. He had a 7th grade education. He published his first Green Book in 1936, and it remained in publication to 1967. Listings in the Green Book blanketed the entire United States, but also later editions included Canada, the Virgin Islands, Europe. 30 countries in Africa were listed in the Green Book. There were also all kinds of articles in the Green Book. Sometimes they were featured by state or by theme, like these here. They're really incredible to look through. It was called the Bible of Black Travel, but it listed more than just food and lodging like a AAA guide. There were also tailors, and there were nightclubs and drugstores and hair salons and haberdashers and sanitariums and funeral homes and real estate offices. It was everything you could ever think you might need on the road. It was also an example of how many places Black people were shut out of during this time. And, I was struck that something so simple and so practical could be so powerful. Because it not only showed Black people where they could go, but it was this compelling marketing tool that supported Black-owned businesses, and it celebrated Black self-sufficiency and entrepreneurship. By 1930, there were about 70,000 Black-owned businesses in the United States, and over the Green Book's nearly 30-year reign, it listed nearly about 10,000 of them, including R&R Liquors here, which is still operating in Nashville, Tennessee. There was also banks and funeral homes. Carver Bank here is in Harlem. It's still operating. The majority of these sites were Black owned, but there were also white owned establishments that were very exclusive, like the Waldorf Astoria, Macy's, Brooks Brothers, the Drake Hotel in Chicago, and the Bel Air Hotel in Los Angeles was also listed in the Green Book. So it shows there were so many different kinds of people, Black people of all different incomes that used this. There were nearly 1,000 tourist homes in the Green Book, and these were largely run by women who, a lot of them were widowed. These were, you could consider maybe the first Airbnbs. It was a place where you could get a warm meal and a room in a house. I'm sure these were largely used by migrant families who were fleeing racial terror in the South. This was an option for those folks. So the Green Book really did serve all kinds of folks. There were other wide-owned establishments like Clifton's Cafeteria in downtown Los Angeles that's still operating, you know, and it was really people like even Clifford Clinton. You know, he was a son of missionaries. He had traveled to China, where he witnessed brutal, abject poverty, and he could not understand how America, a country that was so wealthy, could allow its citizens to go hungry. So even though this was a Depression-era restaurant, he never turned away anybody, even if they couldn't afford to pay. It was pretty amazing. He created what he called this cafeteria golden rule. And even on the menu, it said, pay what you wish, dine free unless delighted. So he was a Christian in the true sense of the word. So it was exciting to find, you know, different business owners that had all these different personalities and different ways to serve humanity, really. The Green Book wasn't the only Black Traveler's Guide. There were close to a dozen other Black Traveler Guides, and the Green Book wasn't the first one either. Hackley and Harrison's Hotel and Apartment Guide here was the very first one. It was published in 1930, only for a year, stopped publication in 31. Then Victor Green's came out in 1936, and these others came out later, Grayson's Guide and this one called Travel Guide. But the Green Book is special because it was published for the longest period of time. It spanned 3 decades, and it had the widest readership. And part of the reason it did was because of Esso. You know, the Green Book was distributed by mail order. It was sold by Black-owned businesses. But there was a savvy media campaign led by Esso gas stations, which operates actually as ExxonMobil today, that was really incredible. There was also a national network of mailmen that Victor Green had encouraged to actually go on their routes because the letter carriers were segregated like everything else in society at that time. So the Black letter carriers served the Black neighborhoods for the most part. And so Victor Green knew this was his audience. So he would have them, he was part of the mailmen's union. He'd have them go out and basically solicit for, you know, these businesses and say, you should probably be involved with this or list in this guide, because it was a great marketing strategy. This combined with Esso, by 1962, the Green Book had a circulation of nearly 2 million people. There was also this woman, Laura Spellman, who I think she was another reason why the Green Book was so popular, especially because the more I learned about Esso, I thought, why were they so kind? Why did they go so far out of their way to help Black folks? But when I learned about Laura Spellman, she was John D. Rockefeller's wife, and she was a white woman, raised by abolitionists though. Her childhood home was a stop on the Underground Railroad in Cleveland, Ohio. Spelman College was named after her. So I think she was the conscience, basically pushing Rockefeller to say, do the right thing here. Again, it was really incredible that this corporation did as much as they did. And I think it's also a calling card to other corporations today, showing what they can do if they want to. Esso hired 2 Black marketing executives, James A. Jackson and Wendell P. Alston. They promoted and distributed the guide, the Green Book. And so again, this was just another thing that made it so much more popular, because, you know, Black people didn't just use this for vacation. It was really incredible. It was an incredible tool, like I said, for Black people who were fleeing racial terror in the South. About 1.5 million Black people were migrating during the time the Green Book was in publication. And when you look at, even in the 1950s, how segregation, was really laid out, just to give you a sense of what travel may have been like for Black people, there were no formal segregation laws in parts of the West and the North. And Black travelers, but they quickly learned that Jim Crow had no borders. And even in California, where it looked like it was fine, it wasn't. They had pools that were only open to Black people 1 day a week, and it would be called International Day, and that was it was right before they were going to drain the pool to clean it. That's the day that Black people could use it, when it was at its dirtiest. There were other things like this. This was 1943, Detroit suburb. We want white tenants in our white community. That was very serious. The North was just as racist as the South. And in some ways it was more dangerous to travel because the segregation signs weren't as popular, but there were still social mores and certain practices that you were supposed to stay in line with. And if you were an outsider, you wouldn't know what those are. Also, Detroit had notorious redlining and housing covenants that made it very difficult for Black people to migrate to settle. There were also sundown towns throughout the country. This was largely a Western and Northern and Middle and Midwestern phenomena. They were signs, or some would ring a bell at 6 p.m. telling Black folks after 6 p.m. they had to leave, which was mostly for the locals who were working in the community. That would be their cue, because they knew the deal, they'd have to leave. But sometimes there'd be a sign on your way into town just saying, N-word, don't let the sun set on you here. So it was dangerous. And Route 66, ironically, again, this is how I kind of first learned about the Green Book. It was notorious for all kinds of trouble. Half of the counties on Route 66 were sundown towns, first of all. You had places like in Edmond, Oklahoma, the Royce Cafe, pictured here, just says right on it, a good place to live, 6,000 live citizens, no Negroes. So they were really clear about what was okay and what wasn't. And Fantastic Caverns was another one where it was in Missouri, a popular Route 66 tourist site that actually still is around today. But back then it was run by the Ku Klux Klan. It is no longer run by the Klan, but it was then. And we actually have, images of them holding their ceremonies in the cave. So yeah, travel was complicated and it was dangerous, and it was kind of going through a minefield. You just didn't know what you were in store for. And there were some states like North Dakota and Missouri in particular, where you can see Victor Green really trying to grapple with this issue of finding more people to actually use, solicit or advertise the guide. You can see here, he says, if you're from Missouri, read this, because he's trying to get Missouri businesses to advertise. And this was actually the only state he did like a full page ad for. The Ozarks were no joke. There's also things I ran across in my research, these businesses that had 3 Ks in the title. Legend has it that these were code for the KKK. I've never been able to find proof. I've discussed this with the Southern Poverty Law Center too. And but here's one in Adrian, Texas, again on Route 66. There's a modern version of this. This was in 2015, Kathy's Country Kitchen. And this is the logo that the servers wear on their shirts. I got caught eating at the KKK. And apparently they're very hostile to the local Somali immigrants. So, we can't say for sure this is a KKK place, but this legend, this history is still remnants of it are with us today. And, again, there were so few options in the Ozarks. And so for folks that were traveling west on Route 66 and heading from Chicago to LA, there was this really intense area where there were just miles and miles and states, almost with very few options. And so by the time a lot of drivers got to Albuquerque, they were getting into accidents. They were basically, and some of them were horrible. I mean, people were dying. And the NAACP basically came out and said, you know, they're tired. They have not been able to find a place to sleep. And that's why it's speed and fatigue that's causing these accidents. So that was happening in the 50s. And these other recreational sites, you know, it was difficult. I mean, you see a lot of this imagery, but even right, you know, before the Green Book was started, this was something that was printed in the Chicago Tribune that said, you know, we should be doing no service to the Negroes if we did not point out that to a very large section of the white population, the presence of a Negro, however well behaved among white bathers, is an irritation. This may be a regrettable fact to the Negroes, but it is nevertheless a fact and must be reckoned with. The Negroes could make a definite contribution to good race relationship by remaining away from beaches where their presence is resented. And what's so great about this project was that Black people still got in their cars and they still did it anyway. They still took vacations like other Americans. You know, to me, it represented this fundamental optimism of a race of people that were facing tyranny and terrorism. And so it was really inspiring to see what Black people did in the face of all of that. I was, you know, for this project, I drove over 40,000 miles on America's 2-lane roads. I used the avoid highways feature on Google Maps, so I'm on a lot of the 2-lane roads. I stay off the freeways if I can. But I saw, you know, beautiful deserts, mountains, beautiful country, you know. And once I started mapping Green Book sites, it became evident, though, that these were not randomly scattered throughout the United States. More than 80% of the businesses were clustered in traditional Black neighborhoods, like Harlem, South Central Los Angeles, and the South Side of Chicago, which Bronzeville here was featured in the Green Book. I saw beautiful buildings. This was a Green Book site in Omaha, Nebraska that's still standing today. It's not operating as a hotel, but it's still standing. And they were picturesque with these beautiful tree-lined streets. But then I also passed miles and miles and miles and miles of blight and boarded up buildings of Baltimore and Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland. And after seeing these communities decimated by poverty and crime and destructive government policies, really, that created these situations, I was furious that human beings were living in such inhumane conditions. And these places did not look like this, obviously, when they were in the Green Book. This is another one, the Wonderland Bar. It's in Baltimore. It's actually still operating. It doesn't look like it is, but it is. This man just walked out of it, and you can see the Coors sign is lit up. And so it is a very real, you know, when I was photographing this one in particular, I realized that I wasn't interested in presenting the Green Book as this kind of historic time capsule. I wanted to show the context of this country's ongoing struggle with race and social mobility, because the problems Black people are facing regarding police brutality, homicide, unfair drug sentencing, mass incarceration, these things are arguably just as debilitating and deadly as the problems that the Green Book was trying to solve back when it was, you know, more than 80 years ago. And when I talk to people who, you know, about the Green Book, when I first started this project, people would say, oh, thank God we don't need that anymore. And yes, it is true that we've made progress, but now when I talk about the Green Book, people think, oh, we need another one. So it's interesting how the times have changed. When I started this project, Barack Obama was in office, and things have changed since then remarkably. But, you know, the thing that's interesting to me is I could still see that indelible scar of mass incarceration that was left on these communities. And, you know, I believe that a century from now, people will look back on this time in disbelief. They will wonder how we could stomach locking up nearly a third of the young Black male population. And this was, mind you, happening during the time we had a Black president in office. But I believe this will be, they'll look back on this time and just think it's just as horrific and shameful as segregation was during the Jim Crow era. Now, I can't help but think this was not the future Victor Green imagined, or even Martin Luther King imagined today. I don't think he could conceive of what we've been able to accomplish since his untimely passing. And it wasn't that the passage of the Civil Rights Act actually fixed anything. We want to believe that it did, but I think we know now that that's irresponsible to say that and to believe that just because segregation was illegal, racism continued to shape our country's policies. After World War II, Black people were blocked from the GI Bill. The Federal Housing Association denied loans to Black people, preventing them from accessing these kind of wealth building opportunities that were freely given to white people. There were harmful policing policies, such as law and order, that was instituted by Nixon, that's led to the incarceration of the situation that we have now. Urban renewal was another factor that came into play when I was doing my field research. This was freeways would just take up where there would be 20 or 30 green book sites along several blocks on a street, and it was just erased and replaced by a freeway. So a lot of these green book businesses were destroyed and the buildings were destroyed in the name of urban renewal and now gentrification. So because I've been so focused on that, I'm really looking at exploring this issue. I got a grant from National Geographic to develop a digital interactive map that will trace Black social mobility over the last 100 years, and everything from lynchings to sundown towns through the lens of the Green Book, but also the educational environmental disparities, whether it's lead poisoning or asthma, incarceration statistics that will be mapped. And I'm finding that some sundown towns are now reporting a Black and brown population, still less than 10%. But if you look closer at them, not all of those Black and brown people are citizens. They're actually in their private prisons. So these communities have inflated their census numbers through this kind of prison gerrymandering system that pulls Black people out of their own communities and places them, at least in the census, into nearly all white communities. And this rise in population, of course, gives these towns more legislative power in Washington, while simultaneously disempowering the Black communities that the inmates left. And I started doing a lot of this research, at the Schomburg Center. I got a fellowship in 2016, and it was a perfect place to really look at this history over time. And also, it's a place where they have the most green books in the country. So I would definitely recommend, if you Google NYPL Green Book, they've digitized all their editions of the Green Book, so you can go through them, and it's a really wonderful archive, and it was a gift that they've given to digitize this. But after I left the Schomburg, I went to Harvard. I received a Hutchins Fellowship under the direction of Henry Louis Gates Jr., where I conducted most of the scholarly research. But thankfully, once I left Harvard, it was a field, it was being on the road. This would have been a very different book if I didn't I spent nearly 2 years on the road doing this research. I put my things in storage in LA and lived in various places that I needed to do the research. So that was a huge gift. And, after scouting these sites, I learned that less than 5% are actually still in operation. More than 75% are gone. And that's why it became so important to document the ones that are left. And when I did find one, it just was this rare, beautiful force of nature. There was just nothing because I'd drive for days and not see anything. So it was quite a journey. And I got a grant from the Library of Congress. I was able to interview the legendary Leah Chase, because I wanted to really look at these business owners. Like, who are these people that managed to keep these businesses around for 80 years? I mean, most businesses close their doors they can barely stay open for 5 years. So this was a really great part of the project as well. These interviews I did are archived. I think they're archived at the Library of Congress, but I think they're going to put them online hopefully by the end of the year. We'll see, because of COVID. I don't know they were supposed to be out by now, but I was also, Leah Chase, she's a legend. I interviewed her. She passed, I think, 2 or 3 months after I was able to interview her at the age of 96. She was a wonderful, incredible, one of the highlights of my career was meeting her. And Nelson Malden, he was Martin Luther King's barber, and he worked on the first floor of the Hotel Ben Moore, which was in Montgomery, Alabama. This was the site where King strategized the Montgomery bus boycott. Malden tells stories in his interviews about his time with King and what he saw. So again, these Green Book sites are just a nexus for, they're just living testimonies of American civil rights history. So we have to protect them. Once I sat down and started writing the Green Book, I realized that one of the gifts the Green Book gives us is it shows us this annual record of Black travel during America's most turbulent decades of racial conflict, leading right up into the civil rights movement. And as I look closer, of course, you realize that American history, racial progress has never traveled in a straight line. So when people say, oh my gosh, it's 2020, why are we still dealing with this? This is really what we do. It's more of a reactionary process. It's a pendulum. It swings forward, we make some progress, and then it swings back. And so my book really looks at history chronologically through the lens of the Green Book, but it really shows those moments where we pushed and we made some progress and what happened, and there's oftentimes a backlash to that progress. As Laura mentioned, I'm developing an exhibition with the Smithsonian Institution. It's the traveling arm of the Smithsonian, and I'm the content specialist and the curator. We're developing a 3,500 square foot exhibit that will travel the US for 3 years. And the Sutherland, actually this is in Chicago, that sign is going to be touring with the exhibition. They actually took their sign off their building to give us to tour it. So that's very exciting. We're also going to feature Murray's Dude Ranch, which is one of my favorite Green Book sites. It was owned by a Black couple. It was in the middle of the Mojave Desert. It's an incredible, the fact that it was a Black dude ranch, first of all, is just amazing. It was on a 40-acre ranch. There were Black Westerns filmed here, Harlem Rides the Range and the Bronze Buckaroo. It was such a rare and special place. Unfortunately, this is an old postcard, but unfortunately, this is what the photograph I took is what's left, which is essentially nothing. But I did find some artifacts digging out in the dirt. I've been there 4 times, but the last time I went, I got to the part of where I could see where the foundation originally was, and I found some old horseshoes and other things, metal pieces that are just, it's incredible. So those, again, will be with the exhibition. It's heartbreaking that Murray's is gone, but as I said, nearly 80% of them are gone. I've cataloged about 10,000 Green Book sites. But it became a priority for me to preserve what's left. So I received a grant from the National Park Service to nominate Green Book sites for the National Register. So I'm currently doing that. And I interviewed Kenneth Jackson. This is his Green Book site. It was called the Dewdrop. His grandfather ran it. It's in New Orleans. It's a legendary place. It was. And he was trying to sell it, and they were going to bring it back to restore it in its former glory. But as far as we know, nothing, that sale fell through. I don't know what the status is right now. But again, these businesses, they were really incredibly important. And I think it's important that we save them. So this is the, just to tell you a little bit more about the exhibition. It will open at the National Civil Rights Museum and this fall, which is the perfect venue because the Lorraine Motel is an extension of the National Civil Rights Museum. This was where King was assassinated, but it was also listed in the Green Book. So it's a perfect place. And the book, as I said, was just released. It was released earlier this year, and It's not really a book about the history of road tripping, and it's even not even just about the Green Book. It's more of a pilgrimage toward understanding a country that's basically so blinded by symbolism that it can't or won't tackle the pervasive, relentless forces that created the environment for the Green Book to thrive in the first place. It's a book that I hope will show us, how we got here and why, after all this time, we still have so far to go. So, in conclusion, I would like to thank the National Council for History of Education for having me. And if you'd like to follow the project, my email is there. That's my website. If you email me, I can put you on my updates list and keep you posted. There's about, I only send about 4 emails a year. I don't put you on a mailing list, and I get too much email too, so I understand. But if you want to follow it, feel free to email me. And so I left some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Candacy. This is fascinating. I could think of a lot of things to ask, but I'm going to share some of the things. I'll just mention that a couple of people were really intrigued by what you're doing, and Laura Macaluso asked about whether you could work on a series of roadway, or if anyone is working on roadway marker signs that tie together Green Book sites across the country. And she was saying that her city would be very open to installing such markers, and that they had done a small Green Book exhibit at her local museum this year in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, no, I am working on a mobile app that will actually give people out of their towns to see different Green Book sites throughout the country. But road markers I haven't explored too much. Definitely, with the National Register, the building could be marked, but not on the road. So I haven't explored that. But yeah, I would love to talk to anybody, I guess, who thinks they would have that ability to set that up. I'd be happy to be a part of that.
And someone else mentioned the Oleander Hotel in Galveston, Texas is an old Green Book hotel, and thought it would be a great place for a project. And then someone also shared that the National Park Service's African American Civil Rights Network is interested in learning about Green Book sites and adding them to the network. And she put a link into the chat for that network so that people could refer to that. A lot of people are excited about your sites exhibition coming. So there are some questions. Someone asked about if there were any parallels between the Underground Railroad routes and the Overland Railroad you researched.
The Underground Railroad and my
yes.
Overground Railroad?
Yes.
I had that question when I went to the Schaumburg, when I was doing research there. And it's really very difficult. There were no established maps of the Underground Railroad, probably for a reason, because then it would show, you needed to have privacy. I mean, you couldn't announce that. So we've never found any real maps of that. I know people have been doing mapping projects of just finding sites and realizing the general route. But I could never really line up like my map of the sites with the Underground Railroad, but I always wanted to. So if anybody out there has access to a map that I couldn't find, I'd love to see it, because I think, obviously that was many decades earlier than the Green Book time. And, I think there's more parallels with the migratory patterns, the trains, the Chitlin Circuit. There were other routes that Black people took when they were traveling.
You may need to explain the Chitlin Circuit, because I'm not sure everyone knows what that is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the Chitlin Circuit was basically a lot of blues musicians that were leaving the South, a lot of times going from Mississippi, Tennessee to Chicago. There were just all of these places where you knew where to stop along the way, where you could actually get food and get, especially if there were bands traveling that were multiracial. It was always so dangerous. And if there was a white band leader, even with a black um, other band members, it became very complicated. So the Chitlin Circus was a great, and there's a great book that I think was published in 2004. I think it's been a while, but that really goes more into detail about that circuit. And a lot of these places had already been in play before the Green Book came into publication. It was just kind of a grassroots um, example of, people just made a way out of no way, and they knew they could only drive so many hours before they had to stop again, and they could find that place that would serve them.
And that another question along the same lines that refers to the kind of listings, and just wondering, people were wondering if the travelers were informing the content of the listings, or was it more the advertisers, the business?
You mean in terms of where they actually would go with where the list?
Well, yeah. So, did the book contain? Was, if someone having traveled would, even if that business didn't buy an ad, who was informing where can you stop in this small town that maybe doesn't advertise?
Well, it would usually be the business that would have to formally advertise. I mean, they could conceivably, I mean, Victor Green had his advertising office in Harlem, and he encouraged people to write to him and tell him, places that were kind to them or that they thought they could go. But as far as, and we've never seen Victor Green write anything. I mean, we can't really confirm exactly how we've pieced together this information and think this is basically how it happened. But essentially, the business would have to be okay with being listed. I mean, I don't think they could just say, oh, this place was, great to me, and you can just add them to the Green Book. But he had such, like I said, an army of people out there pounding the pavement, going out, showing the advantages of being in the Green Book. And it was a win-win. And then those businesses would sell Green Books. We've heard stories that the porters who would kind of hand out the Chicago Defender on the trains would also have Green Books. So it was so, and Esso stations would just have them at their gas stations for sale. So it was a good business model. It made good business sense to be in the Green Book. You didn't have to pay to be in the Green Book unless you wanted a larger ad. And so he had different advertising rates for people who wanted full page ads or quarter page ads. But you didn't, if you just wanted to have a listing, you didn't have to pay. So it was a really, it was a grassroots effort, but it was also a good business. It was and that's not to say that Victor Green made a lot of money. According to the census records, he worked as a postal worker up until the 50s. So largely throughout the whole life of the Green Book, he was still a letter carrier. And his salary in 1943 that he listed was roughly the amount of being a letter carrier. So it's not that he made a lot of money doing this, but I think he saved a lot of lives. And it seems like he at least broke even. His wife, Alma Green, was also a huge player, I think, in the success and longevity of the Green Book. Because again, Victor Green was working full-time as a letter carrier. I know he needed help, and I think she was, and actually Alma Green takes over the Green Book in 1959. Victor Green dies in 1960. So he doesn't even live to see the passage of the Civil Rights Act. When he dies, it still goes on, but it's Alma, who's actually listed as the publisher, his wife, and it's nearly an all-female team that's running the Green Book. So the Green Book has a lot of layers. It's fascinating. So I kind of got off topic, but
I think
I'll,
there is a lot of people are asking also how did non-commercial services like parks and beaches and lakes, how are they represented in the Green Book?
right. I think those were places that, yeah, there was national parks were listed in one edition. There were campgrounds listed. And I think that was more of a groundswell of folks who said these are safe places. Um, to my knowledge, those organizations or institutions didn't coordinate with the Green Book. Of course, we don't really know. But those were even, yeah, beaches, you know, there were just some, Idlewild, that was really popular, these black resorts, you know, Shearer's Cottage and Martha's Vineyard. There were just so many iconic black places that I can assume Victor Green took the liberty of saying, you know, we know that this is a place black people go and that they should know about if they're going to be in this town or this city. They should, you know, this would be important to list. So yeah, and that's again a great advantage of the Green Book because it had so many different kinds of, you know, whether it was department store or different kinds of businesses that you wouldn't find in other travel guides.
Was there was being in the Green Book something that brought negative attention or made that business a target of hate crimes or aggression?
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, there's definitely Green Book sites I've followed. There's one run by Majeska Simpkins. She's featured my book, and she was a fierce civil rights leader. She should be a household name. She was from Columbia, South Carolina, and her Green Book hotel was about 10 miles outside of Columbia. And it got shot up by the Ku Klux Klan like 3 times, you know. But I can't say she was a target because she was listed in the Green Book. She was a target because she was a black business, you know. So it's kind of a chicken egg thing. I haven't heard of any direct stories where it was because they were in the Green Book that they were targeted. Black people were just targeted in general. And obviously even more white businesses that wanted to integrate, you know, that was not something that, it was a risk. It was a huge risk. And I think it was in the 1950s. You see in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education comes into play. And I think that really makes a big change in terms of the attitude. I mean, people, even if they weren't on the side of integration, they realized the tide was changing, that, you know, obviously there were card carrying restaurants in the South that made it so once integration was legal, and it was illegal to discriminate, there were a bunch of businesses that said, oh, well, you have to be, we're a club now, so you have to have a card and be a member of our club, i.e. meaning you had to be white to come here. So there were always shenanigans. There were always, you know, people who didn't want to integrate, you know, found ways to make sure black people couldn't come. And it was always challenging for black folks because there's a chapter in the book called The Double-Edged Sword of Integration that really understands, I mean, the way that we lost a lot of these businesses in the Green Book that were so vibrant and so popular, and there were these rich communities with all of these black businesses, they ended up falling on very, very hard times, and they had a slow, sad demise where they just literally were abandoned. And so it became complicated because, like I showed, the Dewdrop in New Orleans, you know, it was literally when segregation happened that all of a sudden, because black people couldn't really go to the French Quarter before, you know, 1964, they went to the Dewdrop, and a lot of white people from the French Quarter would come to the Dewdrop because it was a place to be. It was amazing, you know. They had drag balls, they had, you know, all these musicians and different acts, these hilarious, just really almost circus acts. I mean, Peg Leg Johnson, there was all these people that had these incredible personalities and personas that were performing. It was the place. And when integration happened, Black folks stopped going there, and white folks, stopped going there as well. So it really was a sad reality that Black people struggled with, wanting to support places that they had always been going to, but they wanted to go places that they had been shut out of. So it was a really sad loss for the Black community, and it still resonates with us today. We've just don't have nearly as many Black businesses that we did during Jim Crow era.
So people were very intrigued by your work with the National Geographic, and wondering if there were going to be digital links that show where all those Black-owned, the Green Book sites were going to be, and also wondering if there's more questions than we have time to answer, unfortunately. And also, so I'll ask too, whether this is something new. Did it appear in fiction prior to the more recent interest in this topic? I guess because of the movie and more research being done about it. Was it ever mentioned in fiction about looking at a Green Book or something? In the 50s or 60s, I guess.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, the first question about the map with Nat Geo, it will be available. And again, if you email me, I can keep you up to date about that. I'll probably have a link to it at least on my website once. I have until the end of the year to finish it. So it'll be, either at the end of this year or early next year that you can do that. You can see the map. And regarding Green Book references in literature, to my knowledge, I have never seen that or heard that it was part of the literature. And again, of course, as we know, the film came out a few years ago, I guess it's been now. And the irony of that is it really didn't have anything to do with the Green Book. I think it was only mentioned maybe 3 times in passing as a reference. So it still baffles me why that was even called the Green Book, or it was a missed opportunity, I think, to tell the story of the Green Book. So, I'm in early talks about optioning the book for a television series, but who knows what will happen. I don't hold my breath for Hollywood, but but there's so many great ways and opportunities to tell this story, and this is part of our civil rights history that we have not explored yet as a culture. So it's ripe for so many different opportunities. So yeah.
We have time, I think, for 1 or 2 more. Can you speak about the areas outside of the United States that were listed in the Green Book that you mentioned earlier? So you mentioned Africa, and so that I guess the question would be, why would they need a Green Book for Africa if they weren't having to worry about, I guess, apartheid? Maybe is it South Africa or?
Well, I mean, when you think of the Green Book, it wasn't just, that's the interesting thing about the Green Book, is it wasn't written in this spirit of, oh my gosh, we can't go anywhere, oh my gosh, there's sundown towns. It was not written in the spirit of fear, which I thought was very interesting. And, if you read my book, you'll see there's, he would have these funny, Victor Green would have these kind of funny stories about how you can, I forget what it was called, but basically it would make fun of, basically you need to be a good driver. So if you want to live, you have to do A, B, and C, and it'd be in this tongue-in-cheek kind of it was very lighthearted, considering how severe the consequences were if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it was a travel guide. It was really for people, Black people who wanted to travel. So yes, he had all over Europe and all over Africa. Like I said, there were 30 countries in Africa that were listed in the Green Book, from the Congo to, Nigeria. It was really extensive. And there were so many people traveling, especially in the 50s and 60s. there was the first accredited Black travel agency. And King went to Africa in the 60s, in the early 60s or late 50s, I think, for his Nobel Peace Prize trip. And so there was a lot of attention, and Langston Hughes was writing about how Black people were treated so much better in Europe and in different parts of the world. So international travel was on the radar for Black folks. And I think the Green Book was just providing guidance on where to go once you got there, and what to wear and how to be prepared for the weather. I mean, it wasn't about, this is dangerous, you're gonna have to, I think that was a subtext, and I think Black people knew, that it took weeks to prepare for a road trip or any kind of trip. You had to be prepared in ways that white people didn't have to be prepared. And so he did not seem to focus on that at all. And I wish we could learn more about him as a person to understand what his personality was. But he was a very tall, handsome, Harlem, almost socialite. I mean, he and his wife, Alma, were beautiful, and they dressed really nice. And like I said, they weren't rich, but they were definitely upper class in the sense that, they had a lot of pride, and so they tended to not focus on those dangerous things.
So as a final question, do you see signs of progress and reasons for hope related to the racism in this country and how things are progressing?
I mean, clearly, in light of the protests and George Floyd, there's clearly something happening, and I don't want to downplay that movement, and I'm very hopeful, but I'm still very realistic about what would have to change for real change to happen. And as much as now we have this corporate response of people saying, oh, we're going to throw money at this problem, and looking at Black organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund or Black Lives Matter. I mean, if Black people could have fixed this problem, we would have done it by now. And it's not you can't throw money at us to say, oh, you fix this. We didn't create white supremacy. It's like white America needs to dismantle white supremacy. We can't do that. If we could, we would, and we would have done it by now. So the paradigm shift and how we look at this problem, how we address it, what the realities are in terms of who, changing chokehold laws is not, well, yeah, I mean, I guess of course, police officers shouldn't be able to choke people to death on the street. And making it a law just like the Civil Rights Act, we changed the laws, and it didn't end racism. So my fear is that without real leadership on being very clear about what has to happen to dismantle mass incarceration, this is the only time I think in our history since slavery that we've intertwined the economy and the imprisonment of Black and brown bodies. And so even what Victor Green was trying to accomplish during Jim Crow was nothing compared to what we're trying to dismantle right now. Because to really dismantle the mass incarceration issue, it would be like what happened in the Civil War, where the whole country would fall. I mean, in the Civil War, the South fell, but this would mean the whole country would fall. McDonald's, their uniforms are made by prison labor. Victoria's Secret, most people's IRAs are funding private prisons. Again, in the back of my book, there's a section called What You Can Do. And it really it's very simple. It's not, this is above my pay grade. I can't fix this problem. But I have ideas about, really things that have to move the ball forward But the fact that we have so much money tied into this now, and we are a ruthless capitalist system, I have a lot of hope, but not a whole lot of faith that we will see systemic, lasting change. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for it. But I've yet to see that at this point, unfortunately. Sorry to end on a sad note, but unless there's another question.
Well, I think our time is up, and I just want to thank you so much. I will definitely be thinking about all of the things you've said and look forward to reading your book. And I've already see that many of the people that attended today, several said they'd already just purchased. So there's a lot of interest and excitement about it. And I really appreciate your time and all of your thoughts, and look forward to continuing working with you in the future with NCHE.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm honored to have been a part of it. And thank you, everybody, for listening and sharing, and for buying the book. That's so great.
Okay, great. All right. Goodbye, everyone. And there is a survey. If you would be so kind to take it, give us a little feedback on our webinar, we'd appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.